Axios reporting Secretary of State Marco Rubio is secretly holding meetings with the 41-year-old grandson of the former leader, Raúl Castro. That's according to three sources. It comes as the Miami Herald warns of a rapidly intensifying humanitarian crisis on the island as the government hardens rationing policies amid a U.S.-led resource blockade. Poverty and food prices are skyrocketing, one pack of chicken now costing a month's salary. And while blackouts are regular occurrences for so many Cubans, last week, two-thirds of the country were in the dark. People in the capital city using whatever coal or wood they have to cook. One woman even telling the AP she ripped wood off her door to make a meal for her children. Neighborhoods in Havana littered with growing piles of rotting garbage because most pickup services are suspended. And with diseases already rampant, people sickened by the smell of trash have started burning it, creating clouds of smoke filled with new toxins. Joining me tonight is Marc Caputo, the reporter behind that Axios scoop. He broke the story. Marc, what more can you tell us about those talks Secretary of State Marco Rubio is having and why the administration picked Raúl Guillermo Rodriguez Castro over any other Castro? Because there have been reports that Alejandro Castro was another shadow league figure, a son of Raúl Castro.
Yes, that report was denied to me, but there are lots of conversations happening at a lot of levels. And so we don't know, for instance, whether someone has actually talked to Alejandro Castro. In the case of Raúlito Castro, little Raúl, or as he's called, El Cangrejo, the crab, he's his grandfather, Raúl Castro, the de facto dictator's bodyguard and caretaker. And Raúl Castro himself is 94, whereas Raúlito is 41. So not only is he a direct line into the real sort of power behind the throne in Raúl Castro, Raúlito also is friends with and runs in the same social circles as the Cuban officials who run the giant military industrial business conglomerate that's known as Gaesa. And then in addition to that, he is known sort of colloquially as a businero, kind of a business hustler, a guy who is involved with people who know how to make money and are therefore sort of a little less doctrinally communist and could be perceived, at least is perceived by the Trump administration, as being potentially more inclined to want to open up and have more economic freedom and more normalization with the United States. So those are sort of the three factors that go into why they began talking with, we don't want to say negotiating with, Raúlito Castro.
Yeah, we have a family tree we want to put up here for our viewers so they kind of understand where Cuba sort of branches off after Fidel Castro. This family tree going all the way back to Fidel and Raúl's parents. So pretty in depth here. So, you know, Marc, I do want to ask you, you know, a couple of years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, if a Secretary of State was speaking to a Castro, it would have been big news in South Florida. What kind of reaction is your reporting getting? Because, you know, we'll get into sort of the strategy here, but before the Castros were sort of off limits to Cuban Americans, and you have the most powerful Cuban American now, Marco Rubio, speaking directly to them.
Right. I mean, this really is big national news. Credit to you for covering it. Obviously, you're from Miami, so you understand the importance of that. This is groundbreaking stuff. Marco Rubio does not shy away from being called an anti-Castro hardliner. He is a product of Miami's exile community, a favorite son. And so the idea that he is talking to one of the scions of the Castro family is just really, really big news in and of itself. It has, if you go back in time, a sort of Nixon goes to China quality to it. It's one of these unexpected moves that's being made, in this case by a conservative, with a communist nation to try to bring about some sort of rapprochement, some sort of understanding, some sort of change in policy. And I think there's a pretty good bet that we are going to see a change in policy. Whether or not the communist government in Cuba goes along with it or not, at least in the short term, I think might almost prove to be immaterial because the situation on the ground there, as you pointed out, has deteriorated so terribly. Yeah.
You know, Marc, do we know what sort of model Secretary of State Rubio and anyone else in the Trump administration is studying, right? It sounds like, it feels like there might be a pattern here, right, where you keep a member of the government in power. We saw this in Venezuela while you take out the head of the government. So you still work with sort of a former regime or the current regime for a bit. It is unlike Iraq. It is unlike Afghanistan, where there was complete regime change there, and that didn't necessarily work in those countries. But we have seen this in history priors, right? In Spain, it happened where they sort of worked with a de facto government there as they were transitioning there, and other parts of Latin America. Do we know what they're studying and what they think the end game is here?
We don't. Part of this is the peculiarity of the way the Trump administration operates. It operates with very closed circles and very small groups of people who make a lot of big decisions. And the best I can tell is that they say, we're looking for the Delcy Rodriguez. Delcy Rodriguez being the former vice president, now acting president of Venezuela, who replaced Nicolas Maduro after the United States took him. And they're looking for someone of her stature or a few people of her stature to sort of help lead a transition government in Cuba in the short term. They're at the very beginning stages of this, looking for those people. I don't think they've necessarily found enough of them yet. They don't have a clear enough plan yet. And Donald Trump hasn't made a decision based on those plans, which I don't think have been fully submitted to him yet, but it's coming soon.
Do you know what sort of the offer to President Trump is? He could understand Venezuela because of the oil there, right? Mm-hmm. The significant resources that Venezuela has. Besides oil, they have all kinds of other minerals. But what does Cuba have that would interest President Trump?
Well, to begin with, it is geographically incredibly important to the United States, and always has been. Thomas Jefferson wanted Cuba to be a state of the United States. Just give you an example of how long Cuba has occupied sort of mental real estate in the minds of American policymakers and politicians. In addition to that, outside of its strategic importance, there is just sort of that personal and political connection that Donald Trump has. The political one, the Cuban-American community in South Florida has been so supportive of him. And they've embraced him, and he's embraced them. And in addition to that sort of political embrace, there's also a personal one. The Bay of Pigs veterans that are still in Miami have a museum, the Brigade 2506. These are the guys that charged over there, sort of got abandoned by the United States under President Kennedy, and those who survived were eventually made their way back to the United States, settled in Miami. Donald Trump has a very sort of personal and friendly relationship with them. He calls them my Bay of Pigs guys. And I think that sort of personal dynamic in Trump's mind should not go underestimated. The last thing, there's just history. The United States has been in a hostile relationship with the Cuban government for 67 years. And various presidents have come and tried to do various things to change that, either by becoming more hostile or, in the case of President Obama, trying to be less hostile and have a rapprochement. In this case, Donald Trump has a real opportunity to make history. He made history in Venezuela, and he can really make history in Cuba, and I think that's going to be an irresistible impulse for him as well.
Marc Caputo, we thank you for coming on Top Story tonight. Big scoop. You can read it in Axios. We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.